welcome to Dignified Resilience. As listeners and viewers are familiar, this is a podcast with guests from different branches of life and people from all around the globe. Yet it is always a truly special pleasure to share any speaking platform, let alone one that I have been creating myself here, with someone who is a Bosnian or Bosniak, an expert from the region, even when we often might engage in conversations about difficult topics. I believe, though, that these uncomfortable topics are necessary to address, especially when they are ignored elsewhere and when there is so much fragility of peace still in the Western Balkans. I'll first introduce my two guests. They are very knowledgeable, two kind men who are experts at what they do and what they study. First of all, Jasmin Mujanovic, he's a political scientist and analyst of Southeastern European and international affairs with a PhD from York University in Toronto. His career background is a unique blend of global academic and professional engagement, as he's worked as a scholar, policy analyst, consultant, researcher, and writer in both North America and Europe. He's also an author of his first book, Hunger and Fury: The Crisis of Democracy in the Balkans, was published in 2018. And he was the co-host of the podcast Sarajevo Calling. On a non-professional note, let me add that he's also someone who's incredibly eloquent and witty. And I'm very thankful to Jasmin because I can use and share his tweets to retweet them almost always. So I don't because I'm embarrassed to do it all the time. But on many, many occasions, if it's about politics in Bosnia and Western Balkans in particular, he says what I think or agree with. So it's an honor that he is here with us today. And my second guest, Harun Buljina, he's a historian of the late Ottoman and modern Balkans, with a focus on Muslim intellectual and socio-political networks in this region. He received PhD in history from Columbia University in 2019 and defending a dissertation on pan-Islamist reform movement in the late 19th and early 20th century Bosnia and Herzegovina. Most recently, he was affiliated with the Center of the Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University. And here, on a non-professional note, I'll say that I first contacted him in 2019 when I learned about his PhD thesis because that topic really interested me, and he kindly shared it with me. And most recently, I listened to Harun when he shares his advice to get off Twitter. So then I get off Twitter and then I enjoy it. And then I learned that Twitter is on fire because of a thread that Harun posted. So then I wrote him a message and I say, how am I supposed to not have FOMO or fear of missing out, Harun? So that said, I want to share again my pleasure for having them today as my guests. And before we begin, to both of you, let me say again, hello, welcome to Dignified Resilience. And how are you today? Any of you?
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'm well, and I'm very excited here to be speaking with you, and also Harun, who unfortunately I haven't physically seen a couple of years, but it's really nice to even share this space with both of you. So thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, Riada, thank you. It's great to be here with you, and also to see Jasmin again after a long time. So I'm excited for the conversation we're going to have here today.
Absolutely. And allow me just one more note. Before we start, I do want to extend my warmest greetings to all those people who, whether in online or offline spaces in specific circles among scholars, activists, academics, ordinary people in Bosnian diaspora and that of the Western Balkans, do continuously talk about things that we will address here today, whether it's politics or history or representation or trauma and grief. And through their effort and their work and their care and dedication, they allow for incredible intellectual growth. They help to all who want to invest time and effort, including myself, to keep learning. So I say thank you, and I don't want to make this sound like some award speech with mentioning tons of names, but because I forget somebody, but I do really hope that those people know who they are. I am grateful, and I try to do my part to contribute constructively to better understanding of our positionality in the geopolitical conjuncture and to share knowledge and our legitimate aspirations, let alone yearnings, to be taken seriously. So that said, Jasmin, first, let me start with you. And of course, Harun, you're more than welcome to always pitch in any of the thoughts. In your opinion, Jasmin, what is the biggest threat in the Western Balkans regions right now, and why?
Well, it's unfortunately, right now at this very moment, it's one of those questions that's hard to answer given the weekend that we've just had. In fact, I would say the last couple of weeks, of course, with not just with everything that we've seen on the Kosovo border, but also in Cetinje and Montenegro more broadly. Nevertheless, I would say that for the better part of the last decade, the kind of primary threat facing the broader region, and indeed this includes this present situation in Kosovo and Montenegro, is the threat of renewed Serbian ultranationalism, and in particular Serbian revanchism, as kind of the stated government policy of the Aleksandar Vučić regime in Belgrade. So we have seen, since Vučić and the erstwhile Nikolić, who has now, of course, disappeared for all intents and purposes, since this kind of rump radical SNS regime has restored itself to power in Serbia, they have very deliberately, with great intentionality, returned to kind of the core principles of Serbia's Milosevic era foreign policy, which is most clearly articulated over the last couple of months by the Minister of the Interior of Serbia, formerly the Minister of Defense, Aleksandar Vulin, namely this project of the creation of the so-called Srpski svet, Serbian World, which of course is both directly playing off of a similar concept in Russian, known as the Ruski Mir, but more prominently and more obviously, very clearly modeled on the Greater Serbia project that Mr. Vučić embraced during the 1990s as a member of the Serbian Radical Party, and which was also de facto the policy of the then Milosevic regime. That is, namely, as Mr. Vulin himself has defined it very helpfully, the political and institutional quote unquote unification of all ethnic Serbs in the Western Balkans, so the creation of Western Serbia. So this, to my mind, is far and away the most pressing security threat in the region. There are others that we can talk about at great length, but, gun to my head, as it were, this is the one that keeps me up at night.
Yeah, and Serbian defense minister confirmed that Vučić government is making plans to introduce mandatory military service recently. This minister Stefanovic said we need more soldiers so the country can have more reserve soldiers. And so much seems to be happening so fast, as you mentioned. And some of our listeners might be more familiar or not, but the recent biggest tensions, let's say, were between Serbia and Kosovo. When the Prime Minister of Kosovo, Albin Kurti, explained that the agreement on reciprocity for license plates of Kosovo and Serbia signed in Brussels expired on September 15, and then official Pristina was introducing this reciprocal measures. So then we know on September 20th, Prime Minister Kurti implemented the decision requiring that all vehicles with Serbian license plates entering Kosovo have to purchase temporary plates with letters RKS, and that caused a lot of tension. Actually, Serbia sent military vehicles and jets to the borders, and regardless of whether those jets were super jets or MiGs, I think that was kind of just purposeful incitement of tensions. And I just want to share what Vjosa Musliu wrote, Albanian scholar at Kosovo 2.0 web portal. She said, to that end, by prolonging a fragile status quo, not actively fueling ethnic conflicts while still not working to suppress them, the government of Serbia maintains Kosovo as an ongoing security threat for Serbia. And so still this constant tension, and then Prime Minister Edi Rama was in Kosovo yesterday. There's a lot of just jingoism that constantly keeps being pumped. But that said, Jasmin, let's mention what you also recently, of course, Harun, again, if you want to share any of your thoughts on this, please feel free. Let's talk about that Open Balkan regional market initiative and the absence of Kosovo, Bosnia Herzegovina, and Montenegro, because I think it's related a little bit to your first answer to my question. You argued in a recent piece for Balkan Insight that the Belgrade's Serbian World foreign policy is fundamentally at odds with its Open Balkan regional market initiative. Can you tell a little bit more to our listeners about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's very simple, right? I mean, the basic premise behind this notion of this Open Balkan or Open Balkans, depending on whose phraseology you want to use, right, is the idea of a kind of common market. And to be fair, this is something that both the EU and the US have kind of been nudging the region towards for a while, especially since the broader project of EU enlargement in the region has obviously concluded. I mean, it seems like we might actually get official confirmation of that in the next few days, but that much has been obvious for a very long time, I think, to anyone with a pulse. So this idea of a common market in the region is not in and of itself bad. The problem, of course, is how, in particular, Serbia has gone about trying to realize this common market. And obviously, the very purposeful exclusion of Kosovo is a very significant issue for any kind of conversation about regional integration. And then, of course, since the kind of original version of this agreement, which was a kind of EU-sponsored, essentially mini Schengen kind of format, that all of these countries signed onto in one form or another a while back, Serbia goes ahead and does this kind of parallel project with North Macedonia and Albania. And I think for a lot of folks in government and offices and just kind of the broader, policy communities in Sarajevo, Podgorica, and Pristina, the facts on the ground have evolved so significantly just over the last few months since that kind of original Schengen format that you would really have to be tremendously naive to believe that Serbia has honest aspirations towards economic integration, free trade, free movement of peoples and goods, at the same time as its government officials are very openly, very clearly stating their territorial and political pretensions against not just Kosovo, but also Bosnia Herzegovina, also Montenegro. And really, if you follow logically the argument that they're laying out, I also include North Macedonia and Croatia, because it's basically anywhere where there are ethnic Serb communities, and there are ethnic Serb communities throughout the region, that, at least Aleksandar Vulin wants us to believe that those people should be integrated into a singular political state, a greater Serbian state under the leadership of Aleksandar Vučić. So that, to my mind, is simply incompatible with any kind of, again, notion of free movement of people and goods. It's just absurd. It's a binary choice. And I mean, I would even go so far as to say that I think, given the events that have transpired over the last few days and the last few weeks, I think it really behooves both Tirana and Skopje to very, very seriously reconsider the steps that they have already taken towards this nominal integration with Serbia. It's simply not in their political or indeed security interests to go very much further down this road. And quite on the contrary, I think we need to very seriously start thinking about some kind of alternative, essentially, dare I even say, alliance structure between the states in the region who are likely and already are the kind of target of this unfortunate revanchism that we see coming from the government in Belgrade.
I really appreciated how you, I don't even want to say bravely, because as you say, it's transparent and obvious to everybody who is both familiar and wants to be honest, when you said in your Balkan Insight piece, in the Western Balkans, quote unquote, the Serbian world is a fact on the ground and a threat to be confronted. Concepts like the Open Balkan Initiative are just fine ideas on paper. And we'll get to, and Harun actually wrote something about EU foreign policy, and we'll talk about it in terms of, and Jasmin just now reiterated how very few people in European Union are really willing to address this fact that Jasmin has talked about. And of course, we know that the president of Kosovo, Vjosa Osmani, has recently again reiterated how she thinks that Open Balkan Initiative is a dangerous initiative for the Balkan region, and that it's something that is impossible, that Kosovo will not accept. Both of you, you want to share your opinions about the role of Republika Srpska as a factor in this whole big puzzle?
Well, I would just add, that I'm struck that even before this most recent discussion about Open Balkan, I mean, going back to the Trump administration and some of the adventures of its representatives in Kosovo, and then, negotiations between Kosovo and Serbia, there seems to be this idea that insisting on liberalizing market reforms will be some kind of panacea for, the situation where you can't make progress on other issues. And it just seems misguided to me, because the two are difficult to disentangle. And we're seeing it now with this Open Balkan project.
Mm-hmm. And Jasmin, you have written extensively over the years about the role of Republika Srpska as a factor and Milorad Dodik. Do you want to still share with our listeners how dangerous is his politics?
Well, I mean, to my mind, Milorad Dodik is the single most dangerous person in the entire region. That is, notwithstanding obviously the kind of authorial role that Aleksandar Vučić and his court in Belgrade has vis-a-vis all of these movements, obviously, that we've seen in Kosovo, Montenegro, Bosnia, etc. Nevertheless, Dodik is in many ways a kind of wild dog on his own, and there are scenarios which we can talk about, and I think people do talk about behind closed doors, as it were, to what extent Dodik and Vučić, that there is a degree of tension between the two of them, and that in many ways Dodik has his own agenda, an agenda that is not so much at odds with the one that Vučić has, but he has a different timeline. And he also has, his biggest priority in the world is his own political survival. And Milorad Dodik is someone who believes that the best way to keep himself safe and to keep himself entrenched in power is essentially through continuously fomenting crisis. The problem is that, when we kind of step back and we look at the broader history of the Yugoslav dissolution, but more broadly, the modern history of the Balkans, and this is obviously something that Harun is, I think, much more well positioned to speak at length about. But my view of the situation is that when you look at all of the major conflicts that happened in this region, essentially throughout the modern period, Bosnia Herzegovina has been at the heart of virtually all of them. It is the strategic center of this entire region, not because it's the most populous or the richest country in the region, but because of its very unique position, and because, unfortunately, historically, both great powers and local powers, Serbia, Croatia in particular, have aspired to essentially dominion and domination of Bosnia Herzegovina. When we talk about the broader dissolution of Yugoslavia, we're talking about 140 to 150,000 people approximately who were killed during the whole of the Yugoslav wars between 1991 and 2001. Fully 100,000 of those people killed were in Bosnia Herzegovina alone. And the Bosniak community alone comprises just under 50% of all casualties during the entirety of the Yugoslav wars. So there's a tremendous disparity of violence that has historically informed the kind of, shall we say, geopolitics and foreign relations of the region, and indeed the military history of the region, all of which is a really roundabout way of saying that any kind of meaningful attempt towards the secession of the RS entity from Bosnia-Herzegovina would precipitate an immediate conflict, because it's simply not going to happen without conflict. And there's no kind of, how can I put it? There's no polite analytical way that I can put this other than to say that I think self-identifying Bosnians and self-identifying Bosniaks, including those who identify as being very liberal, being very progressive, peace-oriented, reconciliation, et cetera, no one is prepared to allow this to take place. And Milorad Dodik likewise is aware of this. He knows that any kind of meaningful step towards the secession of the RS means conflict. The unfortunate fact, however, is that he is an individual who believes that he can profit and benefit from conflict, which is the reason why he continuously kind of toys with this idea. But I think for, on the off chance that there's anyone in the international community, as it were, who listens to this exchange and is still under the impression that there is some future scenario in which the RS can secede from Bosnia-Herzegovina and that will not precipitate violence, that will not precipitate war, it is, to my mind, possibly the most dangerous illusion in contemporary Balkan politics.
And I think that's important for people who are not just within the quote unquote international community to hear, because what you're saying is, as frightening as it seems, something that is a very uncomfortable conversation, but that really needs to be stated out loud. And when you're speaking, I just want to add, to kind of add more context, Bosnian Advocacy Center recently issued a report according to which Milorad Dodik, who is currently under the US sanctions, spent $24 million on lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C. And as Bosnian Advocacy Center wrote in Ismail Cidic in the report, one of the goals, and why I'm mentioning it here, is to finally start changing the narrative, both about the importance of lobbying, as they say, and quote unquote, as well as to be a source for domestic and international journalists who will warn in their articles or work about lobbying against the interests of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also promote the importance and efficiency of lobbying in general. Why Bosnia is not lobbying for its interests, that's a completely different conversation we could have here. But it is, I really agree with the conclusions of the Bosnian Advocacy Center report, and that is that Bosnia and Herzegovina, as they say, cannot rely forever on old friendships and alliances, but must begin to strengthen existing ones and, more importantly, create new ones. And as they reiterate, Milorad Dodik and his regime understand this, and they have been doing this for years now, and hiring different companies in the United States to give like high quality legal advice and just about general presence in the outcome, more of European Union media influence, connection with the Serbian and Jewish diaspora here. So I did want to kind of add this piece of information there to add to the big context, even though today I believe the High Representative in Bosnia did add that under no circumstances will he allow the territorial disintegration of Bosnia, and the US Embassy in Sarajevo did also state that territorial integrity and sovereignty as one country and the Brčko district are guaranteed by the Dayton Peace Agreement, and neither Dayton nor the Constitution of Bosnia give right to secede to any entity. But that said, and Harun, you recently shared your opinion about European Union's foreign policy, at least. The animating drive of respectable European foreign policy in Bosnia is to prevent the creation of a Muslim polity. That's what you wrote, and that's why they simultaneously want to preserve the country's territorial integrity and constantly coddle its Serb and Croat nationalists. Can you elaborate a little bit to our listeners about this frightening thing, which doesn't even seem controversial anymore in terms of just what we are seeing from European Union?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I believe that when I wrote that, I was reacting very specifically to this diplomatic symposium that was organized by the new High Representative Christian Schmidt in Germany, at which the Bundestag president made some comments, including this, you know, a few along the lines of how the territorial disintegration of Bosnia and Herzegovina must be prevented, because the consequence of that would be some sort of, you know, Muslim majority state or entity that would be, I believe the exact quote was, you know, an inherent source of conflict. And of course, you know, I can think of many reasons why the disintegration of the country of Bosnia would be terrible. But the fact that, you know, some resulting rump statelet would have a nominally Muslim majority in and of itself is not necessarily what I would describe as a problem there. And you know, this is something that he said there in this pretty public forum, but it's something we've heard before, you know, from all sorts of prominent European politicians, both more recently and into the 90s. It's really not any kind of secret, you know, those of us who have read the literature or paid attention to the news along these lines. It's not very hard to pick up on it. And to be clear, you know, I don't want to say that we're not talking about some kind of, you know, vast Islamophobic conspiracy or anything. You know, there's obviously supposedly realist concerns, or, you know, something that Jasmin mentioned recently that I thought was very interesting was this sort of preference that many European diplomats portray for people like Vučić and Edi Rama as sort of these people who can make people at the head of, you know, homogenous nation states who can make a claim to being sort of the tribal chieftains of their particular ethnic group. So there are obviously a lot of different factors at play in the geopolitics of the region. But this sort of underlying Islamophobic thinking and perception of a Muslim presence in Europe as inherently dangerous is certainly one strand that has played into that. And when I say respectable, I mean to say that it's simply not even questioned. You know, someone like the Bundestag president can say this very comfortably in a formal setting, and the backlash seems to be very limited to those of us who are from the region to correct him on that.
Yeah, and speaking of that symposium, I want to go back to it because there were a lot more controversial things that were said there. But I do want to just reiterate to the listeners who might be interested about the Western Balkans EU integration story. And of course, we don't have time now to go over the years of mistakes or what should have been done or what was done right, etc. But I do want to ask you this. Reuters today published that according to 4 diplomats and an internal document, the European Union is fearing, quote unquote, a political backlash in member states and can no longer agree to give a guarantee of future membership to the 6 Balkan countries, mostly in the Western Balkans, that is, once promised a place in the club. And now we have the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who began a multi-day visit to the countries of the Western Balkans by visiting Albania, North Macedonia. Then she will go to Kosovo and stay in Montenegro and visit Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And she stated both on her Twitter and, EU is stepping up support for the Western Balkans. We share a common European future. European Union Foreign Minister Joseph Borrell also called on the countries of the Western Balkans to work together with the EU to fight disinformation by raising citizens' awareness and strengthening the resilience of democracies. And there's going to be a EU Western Balkans summit, which would be held in a week, I believe, or less, which he assessed as the most important event at high level in the relations between the two sides. But I want to ask you too, I mean, is this ridiculous at this point, honestly, or rather what should be, is this, sorry, actually, no, EU really old news, or why are we playing this game still? Why is this? And I saw it an hour ago online in some Twitter exchanges as well, when somebody said, well, this is old news. And one member of international academia, name not important, saying, well, this is not true, the status quo is not true. We know from the polls from France that France's opposition is not really correct. So why are we prolonging this game with the European Union, the integration spiel?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm not a political scientist. I know that Jasmin will certainly have more to say on it, but I'm just struck by the fact that for the past, 25, 26 years, this has been kind of the road that was presented to us, right? The notion that the ultimate end goal of Bosnia's post-war political development would be accession to the European Union has been kind of axiomatic. And it's just shaped an entire generation of, politicians, commentators, even, academic analysis in political science and elsewhere. And, it's kind of a dramatic thing to see it unravel, but many of the figures who are still involved came up in that context. So I think when we talk about some of the friction involved there and how we're playing this sort of game where it's happening and it's obvious to so many of us, but people don't want to admit it. I think that there has to be some element of just inertia involved in that. It's been the reality for so long that I think many find it hard to think outside of those terms, have a vested interest not to even.
Jasmin, would you like to chip in?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really good point that Harun just raised. I mean, and I think in some ways, putting aside the kind of the big politics of it, the great kind of, high level politics of it, as it were, I think Harun's point is especially well taken because, for folks who are maybe familiar with the way that the policy community in Europe in particular operates vis-a-vis the Western Balkans, which also includes a lot of people in academia, it is a kind of industry unto itself. And there is several generations of scholars and policy analysts who have come out, not just out of the region, but out of Europe as a whole, working specifically on this topic of EU enlargement in the Western Balkans, right? It's not just dissertations that have been written, it's been books, it's been, millions of dollars, if not more, spent on conferences, research, publications, So there's really a kind of institutional commitment to this topic because this is, I mean, for lack of a better term, what people made their lives and careers on. And so suddenly when it now comes out that, hey, guess what, EU enlargement is over and it probably wasn't ever going to happen anyway, and we probably should have gotten off this train quite a number of years ago and made some kind of alternative arrangements. This is very difficult for a lot of people to for lack of a better term, it's very difficult for them to handle because they don't have anything else to add to the conversation. They don't have a plan B either. And they also recognize that they are implicated in having sold the region and its citizens a false bill of goods for a very, very long time. I think for people like myself and Harun and others that we could name here, who I think have for far longer taken a much more, at the very least, critical view. And, I'm always at pains to point out that I'm the furthest thing from being anti-EU. I think it would be fantastic. It's just that the actual politics of it, how it has been done to date, have been catastrophic. And I've been pleading for years at every opportunity that I've ever had with, EU policymakers from the member states that, hey, We need to do something concrete. We need a plan B. It's very clear to myself and others that, enlargement, as we have hitherto talked about it, is not going to happen. So what is the plan B? We need a plan B, because, it's actually unacceptable from a political standpoint, and from the theory and practice of international relations, as it were, to not have a backup plan. Because when there's no backup plan, there's a void, and that void will be filled. And it's presently being filled by people like Vučić and his Srpski svet. It's being filled by Russia and China and even Turkey to some extent, right? There are other actors on the scene who will want to engage in the Western Balkans if the EU and the broader West does not want to. Yeah. And then the question for us and the people in the region, becomes, okay, well, what are the values and what are the interests that these other actors are bringing to the region? And, as somebody who does identify as, as being, I would say, progressive and liberal, and I am categorically committed to the idea of democracy and the rule of law, it alarms me greatly when I see Putin and Xi and others, running roughshod over the region, imposing their values and their norms, and incorporating the region into their kind of global project. So this is unfortunately the moment that we're in right now, where the EU doesn't have the capacity to act as a credible foreign policy actor, or even just a credible actor in the region writ large. But at the same time, it is also either incapable or refusing to offer any kind of alternative framework. And so in that sense, this is really the worst of all worlds. And I would hope that, perhaps among, my colleagues in the policy and academic communities, it would be us who would be able to, at the very least, start having some conversations, more concrete conversations about where can this region actually go in the future. Because, what, I've been wrong about plenty of things in my time. I'm going to be wrong about things in the future. Let's just move on. Okay, so the EU thing didn't work out, and a bunch of people kind of put all their eggs in that basket. Fine, let's just move on. I'm actually not interested in dunking on anyone. I'm not interested in being right at the stake, or at the sake of the welfare and lives of millions of people in the Western Balkans. I do want us to be able to move forward, but that actually requires talking very seriously about where the region is right now. And the region right now is in a pretty bad place, and apparently getting worse.
And you touched a little bit upon it in this political context, but I do want to continue this conversation by mentioning that one part of that famous Harun's thread, as I will call it from now on, is that he cited an example. So I will just cite as an example of many similar occasions, about a conference at the University of Vienna that was dedicated to narratives and stagings, quote unquote, of victimhood around the genocide in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And Harun raised his objection about no mention of accelerating denialism or virtually any Bosnian or Bosniak speakers for that matter. And that tweet and that thread erupted. I mean, each one of those thoughts that you shared resonated with so many people who then first very often do talk about this in their communities, but who started and adding, commenting, sharing their experiences, personal and professional, that reflected similar ideas. So I do want to ask you for your, can you elaborate a little bit on this? Because we might talk a lot about this, but I do want our listeners who might not be Bosnian, but who are listening to this podcast to understand, and many maybe who might kind of see themselves in their own kind of community in terms of representation, or rather let's just, who can write or who can work on Bosnia and Herzegovina?
Yeah, so I mean, just to answer the very last question there, in terms of who can write about it, who can study it, I think the short answer is anybody. Just about anybody can write or study about it. Maybe with the exception of actual war criminals, or entities that are responsible for war crimes, because they too have tried to set the record for publicize their narratives of the recent past. But beyond that, just about anybody can. And I'm glad that you asked the question, because obviously, with that whole thread and the discussion that followed, that came up, and I know that we, I feel we have to address it, but in a way, it is a little frustrating that we do have to address it, right? For at least two reasons. One, because as far as I'm aware, I don't think actually any of us on the, let's say, Bosnian camp ever actually suggested that, non-Bosnians or whatever should not write about Bosnia. That was just not an argument that was being made. I can't vouch for, cartoons with like 15 followers, but those of us who are there with first and last names, like no one was seriously just suggesting anything of that sort. And then the other part of it too is that, I mean, even if we for some reason had, like what consequence of that would there be? How would we actually enforce something like that? Because that really brings it back to this question of power. And the reality is that the relevant power dynamics that I was trying to get at a bit with that thread go in completely the opposite direction. And you can have someone like, okay, just to give a very specific example, Jessica Stern and that whole book about Radovan Karadzic and her war criminal that tried to, provocatively humanize Radovan Karadzic. I mean, the fact that that can be so easily published, that it can get a major publisher, that it can get plaudits and praise from prominent academics at major academic institutions, that it can receive space in the major, media in the United States. What would it take for a Bosnian person to be able to present a similar work on, their experience with Radovan Karadzic and, just the genocide in Bosnia in general? I mean, I think the answer is self-evident, really. And it's worth pointing to that, to the extent that people from our community who were rightly outraged with that, reacted against that book, a lot of it, so many of us, we don't come from some sort of point of institutional backing. There's no big Bosnia lobby. There's no Bosnian state effort to counter, propaganda or whatever. The vast majority of us are basically like refugees and other people who ended up in Western countries due to everything that happened in the 90s. And, in that sense, it's been kind of an uphill climb to have some sort of platform and to be able to raise our concerns and be part of this conversation so that these sorts of things aren't just out there and unquestioned. And that's, one specific example, but I think in terms of that thread in general, that's kind of what I was getting at. It's not that I think, certainly not that, we need to draw some sort of strict native, non-native binary or anything like that. It's just that, what is this discourse around Bosnia, particularly in that case that we're seeing in the German-speaking countries, and what is its relationships with this wider context that exists outside of the ivory tower, and what is its relationship with actual Bosnian people, and in particular the survivors of Srebrenica. So that's something that there's much more to say about, including with that conference, but also some of the other things I mentioned.
Jasmin, would you like to?
Yeah, I just really wanted to chime in on that, one of those last points that Harun made, because I ended up kind of thinking about it for days, this notion, that he raises sarcastically of the big Bosnia lobby. I think it really cannot be overstated, the extent to which, Riada, this goes back to the point that you were raising earlier with the report that came out recently about lobbying from the Bosnian Advocacy Center. Even that name, right? Bosnian Advocacy Center. And I've worked with them. They're a tremendous group of young people. They organized a really wonderful event a couple months ago that I was very happy to moderate, with Senator Lieberman. And the thing is, our community more broadly, all of us who identify as Bosnian, which is, of course, is more so than simply the Bosniak community, there is nothing behind us. There is no money behind us. There is no institutional power behind us. There is no chair in Bosnian studies. There is no scholarships of any meaningful sort that are offered to our kids. Our families, including those in the diasporas, these kind of intergenerational families that have settled in places like Canada or the US or even, parts of Europe, our families are still dealing with legacies of PTSD, legacies of trauma in various forms, and all the things that come with that, whether it's domestic abuse, whether it's substance abuse issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's really important to highlight when we look at something like the platform that is Twitter and social media more broadly, it creates this illusion of power, and I get that a lot because whatever, I have X amount of followers and people think, oh, well, who's this guy? And he must have, blah, blah, blah. I'm just a dude with a Twitter account that and I've been doing this for a while, and I've been fortunate that, I've got a little bit of an audience. There's no money behind me. There's no institution behind me. And I think, Harun is somebody who I know personally. You know, I've seen him grind and hustle off. I know so many other people like that who have had to overcome these tremendous boundaries and barriers because there is no institutional support behind us, up to and including, and this is something that you raised, Riada, earlier as well, you know, we don't have backing from the Bosnian state either, right? A lot of this kind of quote unquote lobbying or advocacy that so many of us are doing is purely voluntary. And oftentimes it's literally attempting to fill an institutional gap. Things that, for instance, a functional Ministry of Foreign Affairs should be doing is actually left to, you know, a bunch of millennials with Twitter accounts, right? Because that is unfortunately another legacy of the war and the genocide, that Bosnia Herzegovina as a state is so fragmented and so divided. And so it is almost up to private initiative and private individuals to promote and elevate and advocate on behalf of the interests of the broader Bosnian community and the Bosnian state and the international community. You know, we're doing the best that we can. I think we have a lot of lessons to still learn. I think I'm a huge champion of learning from other diasporas, the Jewish diaspora, and I think historically of critical importance for the Bosnian and Bosniak community, because they were champions in the 1990s during the genocide when it counted most. And you know, they laid that road in many ways that we need to learn from. But there's so many other, I would even say like the Kosovar diaspora in many ways has done a better job vis-a-vis some of these core political issues than the Bosnian diaspora has. And so I'm trying to use my platform to speak to many of these issues, but also trying to think about the kinds of institutional legacies that we can leave behind us for the kids that are coming up behind us, who I hope won't have to deal with the same barriers and boundaries that I think all three of us and kind of our cohort are still dealing with to this day, even those of us who are, you know, perhaps in a slightly better kind of socioeconomic position now, or, you know, whatever.
Yeah. Yes, a million times yes. And just to kind of reiterate to the listeners, and one piece, if they want further reading on what we've been saying, I really want to warmly recommend Adnan Delalic's Wings of Denial that he wrote on Mangal Media. I read it this morning, and it is like a classic that I think 20, 30 years later will be able to be read. And allow me just 30 seconds, I want to read one paragraph from that, which kind of nicely summarizes everything that we've said. And he's referring to Peter Handke, which we haven't mentioned so far, but, you know, Nobel Prize in Literature was awarded in 2019 to an Austrian writer who is a Bosnian genocide denier. But in a grand scheme of things, as Adnan Delalic, and someone who I really learn a lot from, so saying hi to him virtually, he writes, Peter Handke gets to spend his time on artful self-expression and formal experimentation. As suggested by the Nobel Committee, he gets to explore, quote unquote, the periphery and the specificity of human experience, end of quote. He makes use of his powerful European passport to travel to the killing fields in the periphery, places the displaced and exiled can't return to, and produce literary selfies. European intellectuals and institutions then declare his colonialist corpus as representative of European civilization. Thus, hierarchies are being maintained. We, meanwhile, are being forced to invest an enormous amount of time to protect ourselves from this violence, including those of us who were lucky enough to somehow obtain a Western passport. Handke, by contrast, easily received a Yugoslav passport from Milosevic regime in 1999, while hundreds of thousands of Kosovo Albanians were being stripped of theirs. As Toni Morrison says, racism keeps you explaining over and over your reason for being. I just got goosebumps, honestly, and so many of these paragraphs, and what Jasmin just said and Harun reiterated as well. And so many people did chime in online and shared professional and personal experiences. And it is this constant both dehumanization, but also what Harun wrote. I think that there is a rise of self-consciousness among young academics or people from different branches who don't have to just be working in the academia, who are doing their best within their resources and scope of possibilities to raise awareness, because genocide denialism on one hand, as we have mentioned here, and Harun touched upon Jessica Stern's book, besides genocide denial, and that is the questioning the number of victims of the Srebrenica massacre, Srebrenica genocide, complaining on an international anti-Serb conspiracy, and glorifying Bosnian Serb wartime leaders, which are just some of the tactics by the Srebrenica genocide deniers. We have now a situation when genocide research shows that it has gone to academic literary sphere at international level. And Jasmin wrote about great replacement theory for many outlets, and why. Jasmin, you can tell us shortly about it. How is the essence of Mladic project important in the Western far right contemporary thought?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it goes to, it's very much in conversation with the quote that you just read from Adnan's marvelous essay, right? It is this idea that as we have seen this kind of broader anti-refugee, anti-Muslim, xenophobic, also anti-Semitic turn in European and Western politics more broadly, self-identifying members of the far right as all kind of functional ideologues always look to the past to find examples of the kinds of regimes that they want to imagine in the future. They're in a perverse way. The far right is very much obsessed with history. I mean, in their own extremely toxic and malign way, but they have a very peculiar obsession with history, as it were. And I think for them, the experience of the Bosnian genocide, and in particular, the kind of the ideological discourse and the narratives and the rhetoric that came out of people like Radovan Karadzic, above all, because he did style himself as this kind of quote unquote philosopher and a poet and all this kind of jazz, but also Ratko Mladic and, his infamous speech upon the entry of Serb nationalist forces in Srebrenica in July of 1995, taking revenge against the Dahijas, et cetera, et cetera. This is exactly the language of the far right. Right. This is exactly the discourse, the civilizational clash, this kind of binary conflict between nameless, racialized Muslim hordes that represent everything dark and sinister in the East, and et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, their idea of Serbia on the ramparts of Christendom, defending Western civilization, quote unquote, et cetera, et cetera. So this is nearly verbatim the Great Replacement discourse, right, down to and including the whole obsession about demography and being outbred and being replaced and all the rest of it. And of course, there's a tremendous malleability to this discourse, right? In parts of the American Southwest, as we saw during the El Paso shooting, it can be used to apply to Latino and Hispanic people. In other parts and in other contexts, it can specifically refer to Muslims. It can refer to Jewish people. It can be extended to the LGBT community. Anyone that can be characterized or conceived of as some kind of threat to this, very peculiar notion of white Western civilization and masculinity. That is who can be swapped in. It's just the case that in the particular context of the Bosnian genocide, and I think specifically vis-a-vis the question of kind of Muslims as a demographic threat to Christendom and Western civilization, it is in some ways the most salient and the most acute threat, at least in the imagination of the far right, which is again why when people like the Christchurch terrorist or people like Anders Breivik and others, when they look to Bosnia, when they look to Kosovo, what they are seeing is a model of the kinds of societies that they want to replicate in their own countries, right? This is what they want. They want this cull. They want this killing. They want this kind of confrontation, in the same way that they look to Nazi Germany, or that they look to the Confederacy, or that they look to the apartheid regimes of Southern Africa. Those are also models, much like as the Bosnian genocide and the kind of Greater Serbia project has now emerged as a relatively contemporary and recent model.
And Harun, tell me, you're an expert on this and very familiar. I do want to ask you about your opinion, again, about this anti-Muslim rhetoric that's been present for so long and in this region. Do you agree, or could you elaborate a little bit about a a quote, but a book, for example, and there are many books that Fikret Karčić and other scholars wrote. One that I want to share here, it's from the book Other European Muslims. The quote says, the Balkan Muslims have been trying to preserve their existence, especially as a distinct religious cultural entity in their homeland since the end of the Ottoman rule in the region. The consecutive hostile regimes did not allow the Balkan Muslims to consolidate and to develop their theoretical and institutional responses to the challenges of life in the European Southeast. And of course, we know about the painful but slow restoration of Christian Europe, etc. But can you elaborate a little bit to our listeners so that I understand the historical longevity of this idea of, or just to add on what Jasmin has been saying?
Yeah, I think there are things to be said there. I mean, first off, to start with that, Fikret Karčić is certainly an authority on the history of Islamic institutions in Bosnia Herzegovina. So if people are interested in that sort of thing, to definitely check out his work, as well as the work of his sons more recently, who are also doing some really cool research. But beyond that, given the talk we just had about this great replacement theory in the place of the Balkans, I mean, I think what Jasmin is saying is very valid. But I also think that what sometimes we lose sight of is that in the not so distant past, in say the early 20th century or earlier decades, in many ways the situation was about these, we have these conspiracies about, the great replacement, Muslim birth rates, this and that. In a not so distant past, the situation was almost reversed. Especially in the Balkans, there was this very real fear that Muslims in a place like Bosnia Herzegovina had, that their very existence was threatened. Yep. Both in terms of mass emigration to the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the ambiguities of living under non-Muslim rule for the first time, after many, many centuries, in the case of the 1878 Austro-Hungarian occupation. And also, when you get to 1912 and 1913, the Balkan Wars, which are really the foundational historical context for the entire Kosovo conflict and really much of, what carried through in what would become Yugoslavia after that, Muslims in Bosnia in particular got to see this massive, widespread violence against Muslim communities in neighboring regions. So for such a long time, and I think this is part of what Professor Karčić is getting at, is there was this real sort of insecurity and then sense of question of, well, would we as a community even survive physically, in light of migration, in light of state violence and so on. And that has also, of course, profoundly informed, Bosnian Muslim intellectual and socio-political responses. And it's important for making sense of the entire kind of trajectory and development of Bosnian Muslim political thought through the 20th century. So I think that kind of connects both what we were just talking about and then also Professor Karčić's statement. One thing I would also add to that, though, is just that even though there were, successive hostile regimes and such, it's important to keep in mind, too, that there was always some room for maneuver. And I'm thinking in particular about something like the Islamskazajednica, the Islamic community. And here I can refer back to, research by myself and by some of my friends in history. I mean, my friend Leila Amzi, who's a professor at Rutgers now, wrote a great dissertation. It's about to be a book, in which, among other things, she looks at, the origins of the Islamskazajednica in 1878 and with the Austro-Hungarian occupation. I mean, in many ways, this was basically a colonial institution. This was an attempt by Vienna to create a new kind of local Islamic religious hierarchy that would sever ties between Muslims in Bosnia on the one hand and the Ottoman Empire on the other. But what you see over time is that locals, take up those institutions and find a use for them on their own terms. It becomes a place for, various local Muslim reformists to pursue their own agenda of communal reform, pedagogical reform, all these sorts of projects. And it culminates in something that I wrote about in my dissertation, actually, which was in the early 1910s when the great reformist thinker, Jamaluddin Čaušević, becomes a new Reis al-Ulama. I mean, this was a very kind of revolutionary moment. They were making appeals to this new constitutional language, to elections and civil liberties, and this, context that they were living in the wider region. So even though, there were anxieties about living under a non-Muslim power and about the fate of Muslims as a community in that region, there was still some room for maneuver. And a big part of the story is just how these sorts of different intellectuals and activists were able to exploit that and what they were able to create from that as well. That's a big part of the story as well.
And that is an incredibly amazing and fascinating part of the story that I'm personally very interested in learning more about, and why I believe in the grand scheme of Islamic studies, what you have been talking about beyond just political context is so important. And I'm so grateful that you shared just a glimpse of that scholarship that I think anybody who is interested more should learn about. I do want to then mention, just come back now to 2021, and something that Jasmin did point out so precisely, how Serb nationalists were so happy about the success of Taliban, because continuing to this anti-Muslim situation idea. Jasmin, you can just share a little bit about it, because it is a continuation of this Islamophobic prevalent idea in their heads.
Well, yeah, I mean, so this is obviously the great irony, right? The same people who will refer to Sarajevo as Jalalabad, or will refer to Sarajevo as Tehran, when the United States finally withdrew from Afghanistan, literally the exact same people were trumpeting and hailing the success of the Taliban as supposedly this great anti-imperialist force, and supposedly anti-colonial force. And of course, very specifically, I mean, the thing that we were seeing come out of the kind of Serb nationalist social media discourse, including, very prominent people who have positions on Russian state media, et cetera, was this idea that, Kosovo and Bosnia were next, right? This idea that, this is the United States withdrawing from international primacy. This is the end of the quote unquote empire. And so, Kosovo primarily is next. And I think there's so many ways to unpack that discourse and that idea. The one that's really interesting and fascinating to me, though, is, and I think it's important that we talk about Kosovo in this context, this idea that Kosovo is some territory that is waiting to be quote unquote liberated by Serbia or the broader Serb nationalist establishment, a country where, upwards of 92-93% of the population is ethnic Albanian and has, let's just put it, very strong views about, once again, being under Serbian dominion, right? It once again actually brings to the fore immediately the specter of violence and genocide, because the only way, practically speaking, that you could have a situation where Serbia once again has dominion and administration over Kosovo is if 92-93% of the population is no longer there. In other words, they've been expelled or they've been exterminated. In other words, a repeat of what happened in large parts of eastern and northeastern Bosnia over the course of the Bosnian War and the Bosnian genocide. And so, it is the lack of progress. It is the lack of any kind of meaningful transformation in, unfortunately, so much of the Serbian mainstream. And I'm always at pains to use the language of Serb nationalism, because it is not accurate to say that this is the view of all ethnic Serbs or all Serbians. There are progressive, liberal, anti-chauvinist forces in Serbia and across the region, among ethnic Serbs. But the unfortunate reality is that, as far as the mainstream discourse is concerned, in Serbia, it is dominated by historical revisionist positions. It is dominated by chauvinist and xenophobic positions. You can turn on any major daily news program in the country, or open any major newspaper, and you will be confronted with the language of chauvinism, with the language of historical revisionism. And ultimately, it is also the stated official policy of the government in Serbia, right? And so the idea that these people would then cross-identify with the Taliban or with any other kind of supposed anti-American group in the world, to me is it is extremely telling, because it points to the kind of categorical and fundamental reactionary nature of this project that they espouse, and in that, by that same token, how it is just a categorical threat, not only to predominantly Muslim communities, whether they are Albanian or Bosniak or any of the other ethnic Muslim communities in the region. or indeed now increasingly ethnic Montenegrins, and I would even say ethnic Macedonians, ethnic Croatians, et cetera, but more broadly, it is an assault and it is a threat to any kind of notion of, constitutional rule of law, constitutional governance, liberal democracy, all the things that, all three of us in various ways in our lives have been fortunate to experience, and I would think to a great extent want to replicate in Bosnia Herzegovina. So, this is the thing. It isn't merely that, what keeps me up at night, to go back to that phrase, and it's true, it isn't merely that I am aware of the fact that given the right circumstances, that the people in power in Serbia would literally like to kill me and the people in my community, and that they are advocates for that kind of policy. It's not just that. It's not just about my own personal, background or personhood or my identity, whatever it may be. And it's usually not what people think it is, but it's also the fact that at a very kind of fundamental political and philosophical level, this is a threat to anyone that aspires to live in any kind of form of freedom or security. And in that sense, I mean, this project that has kind of reared its very ugly head again in Belgrade is a threat to Europe. It's not just, Muslims in the Balkans who need to be concerned about this. It is a categorical threat for democracy as such in Europe, whether it's recognized as such or not, and very clearly it's not. I mean, given the conversation that we've been having today.
Harun, please feel free to add anything to what Jasmin elaborated on before I ask you about the episode of chosen trauma, which is something when Jasmin tells me, just said something that keeps me up at night. I think that one of the most recent fiascos that happened and that you addressed was this occasion. I believe, was it the same symposium that you previously addressed when German historian Marie Janine Kalic gave a speech before a high-profile diplomatic symposium, and including the High Representative Christian Schmidt. And towards the end of her speech, she kind of singled out the recent Valentin Minsko last High Representative, his decision to outlaw genocide denial, and she said it angered the Serb nationalists, and then she compared that with a claim that quote unquote Bosniak nationalists have made Srebrenica their chosen trauma to avoid reconciliation with Serbs.
What to say? It's an open question. I mean, what can one say to that? To me, it's kind of absurd on a number of levels. I mean, the fact that we can talk about Srebrenica in a matter of choice, to begin with, and then these allegations that is something that's being instrumentalized for political purposes. I mean, it's all deeply frustrating. But that was one of the things that I wanted to raise with that thread. Unfortunately, I hate to go back to the conference in Vienna, but this language of staging and such, there seems to be this emphasis that we're seeing in these German-speaking, academic contexts, where the interest in Srebrenica is about how it's this kind of nationalist project, or like a Bosniak nationalist, performativity of some sort, and it's just really bewildering, given that we still have, high-level genocide denial, the casual embrace of Peter Handke, and the sort of trivialization of his association with war criminals. Shortly after that, I finished that thread, we had a new magazine cover for Süddeutsche Zeitung that, talked about, it was just this glowing little puff piece that talked about Handke's association with war criminals, alongside his interest in Bob Dylan records and life as a grandpa or whatever. So, I mean, we have this trivialization and outright genocide denial. We have, the continued obstacles that survivors of Srebrenica face on the ground in Srebrenica and in Republika Srpska more generally. And, it just, it's infuriating that the focus seems to be more on this, abstract academic study of the constructed aspects of Srebrenica commemoration. Yeah, I think that's the gist of what I would want to say on that front.
And I think after that, a lot of people, and I don't speak German, but Jasmin does, or many other who do, have added that that was not apparently the first time that this particular historian has said this. In another article in 2020, November, she also qualified the genocide in Srebrenica as a chosen trauma by Bosniaks then as well, or repeated that. So do you want to add something to that, Jasmin? I do just want to mention, or maybe where this conversation can take direction, what Emir Suljagic, who is the director of Srebrenica Memorial Center, he wrote, and this is my translation, he wrote it in Bosnian. He said, strong efforts, millions of marks of budget money invested in the denial of genocide should be understood in that context. Serbian nationalism and its traditional allies, read German and other Central European nationalism, actually want to define our lived and historical experience. Denial of genocide is not an end in itself, but an integral part of the historical narrative, which was once successfully imposed on us. And then he elaborates how the difference, from one, he says, is from the beginning of this, this is only one occasion. And secondly, equal important is that Yugoslavia objectively was not our state. But what do you want to say anything, Jasmin, about this idea of defining our lived and historical experience? We did mention it throughout this conversation so far, brushed upon it, but specifically about what's been going on recently, and what do you think these conversations online and offline are leading towards?
So, I mean, first of all, we were talking earlier about this notion of institutions, and you bring up Emid and the Srebrenica Memorial Center, and there is an institution that now exists. And largely thanks to, I think, the leadership of people like Emir Suljagic and this incredible team that he has around him. And it's so important, the work that they're doing right now, that they're digitizing so much of this information, so many of these narratives, so many of these accounts from survivors, from their children, alongside institutions, for instance, like the World Childhood Museum in Sarajevo, right? There's now a very small number of these institutions that exist, but they're doing so much heavy lifting to simply place the story of the Bosniak people and the Bosnian people more broadly in our recent and very unfortunate experiences during the 90s, but also situating them in a very important historical context. And that is something I think that all three of us, if we were to have these conversations for a more sustained period of time, I think we would find how much historical erasure has taken place in terms of what the early 20th century looked like, what the late 19th century looked like, what the mid 20th century looked like, right? And traumas and these kinds of historical experiences have as the effect on the lives of individuals to sever these narratives. For instance, I actually have very little information about, for instance, like my great-grandparents. Like I know very little about them because of the very painful and difficult historical circumstances that my grandparents and then my parents found themselves in. So even my ability to tap into my own story, as it were, in that sense, is mitigated by the political realities that my family and the communities that they were embedded in had to go through, both in the early 20th century and at its close, right? So that's one point. The other point, though, to go back to the conversation and the points that Harun raised, this idea of a quote unquote chosen trauma, outside of the completely revolting kind of premise of it, what it belies is a tremendous amount of hostility and dehumanization of Bosniak and Bosnian people more broadly, right? Because, I mean, what kind of madman do you have to be to believe that anyone would choose this? That you would choose to have gone through the experiences that any of us went through, right? And I'm always at pains to say, my family is from Sarajevo. We were very fortunate that we escaped Sarajevo very early on in the war, because I'm cognizant of the experiences of the people who stayed behind, and of course the people in Eastern Bosnia, in Srebrenica, in Bijeljina, Foča, Zvornik, and on down the list, because I know what they went through, right? And I encountered them in refugee centers in Croatia and Germany, and as a young child, I was exposed to those experiences and those narratives, and even then I understood, in my own very childlike way, what it was to be privileged in the very peculiar way that we were privileged, because, you know, we got out when we got out, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So what kind of mental framework and moral and ethical framework do you exist in that you would be a scholar and you would be aware of Srebrenica and Foča and Zvornik and Bijeljina and Prijedor and all the rest of it? And you would look at that and you would say, it's well, you see, this is discursive. This is a narrative. This is performative. It belies a really, truly deep-seated chauvinism, and I would even go so far as to say genuinely hatred of those people, because you could not actually articulate that idea in any other sense unless there was something revolting to you about these people's humanity. And it's the same thing when we're talking about homophobia, when we're talking about anti-Semitism. Hatred is at its root. It is the animating principle. And I think for many people in you know, kind of the broader Western Academy, and you know, Harun has been in the thick of some of these conversations, as have you, of course. You know, we're talking now to some of our colleagues, whether they're German, Austrian, British, American, whatever, and they're coming back to us now, and well, why has the discourse suddenly become so sharp? And I think a lot of the reason is because now there is finally a generation of scholars, of activists, of thinkers, of writers, et cetera, who are able to give voice with relevant platforms. And of course, our platforms still pale in comparison, right? This was Harun's point earlier. None of us here could write a book about anything that would get, you know, top billing in the New York Times, never mind a kind of quasi-erotic hagiography of a war criminal and a genocidaire, right? So that's the reality of the situation, that we're only now in a point where we have any kind of platform. And the mere act of speaking our truth and speaking our narratives and telling our own stories, that in itself is being perceived as an act of hostility on the part of certain people who have been entrenched in certain very comfortable narratives, ensconced in institutions where nobody has come along to them and said, hey, what you're saying is deeply, deeply revolting and so not okay. And if it were about any other group of people in any other context, you would be called out for it, right? And so this is, I think we're in the midst of a really profound generational shift. I really, really believe that. And it's not because I'm sort of high in my own supply and I think I'm like on the cutting edge of history or something, but I see it in kids younger. You know, when I look at the kids who are coming up who are in their early 20s, even who are in their teens, and I get some of their emails, and you know, they're asking me about, hey, like my professor or my teacher said this thing and this came up and like this kind of seems wrong, but I can't articulate why. And then you start having these conversations with them and it's like, okay, right. So they have different expectations. The very fact that they know to ask, the very fact that they have someone to ask, the fact that they, you know, those alarm bells are going off in their head, I think speaks to some very small but very important progress that we've made. Suffice it to say, I don't see the civility of the discourse improving anytime soon, because I you know, I'm going on, sorry, but like I don't think any of us are coming back from this position, right? Like there's no going back. Nobody's gonna be like, well, you know what, actually, yeah, it's fair that the Austrians have a slightly different perspective on the Bosnian genocide. No, it's actually not okay. And the aim will be to evacuate them from the discourse, because no, you know, it's very clear that no more. It's just not going to fly. And like if that means that we're not invited to polite conferences anymore, that's fine. We'll make our own conferences, because now the power dynamic has shifted to some extent, and we do have access to certain kinds of resources that will allow us to take those kinds of initiatives and those kinds of steps.
And we'll keep creating them creatively. And this is one platform that, you know, is allowing this sort of conversations to thrive. I do want to ask you, Harun, about both your opinions on this trauma and intergenerational legacies, and your idea of what might be going on in the future in terms of these conversations. And I just want to add this idea of mentorship that Jasmin, you mentioned and you often reiterate and emphasize online. I do want to say that two things: how this idea of I'm still being mentored, even if they don't know, in terms of how I keep learning. I want to mention, for example, a really great scholar, Edina Bećirović, who's extremely kind and knowledgeable and expert in genocide on the River Drina and numerous papers that she's been writing. And then she's always incredibly kind and willing to teach me and offer her knowledge whenever I'm in touch with her. And I don't know whether I will cut this, but I do want to say it because Jasmin mentioned it. A couple of years ago, I had one of the most important conversations with Haris Halilović, who is a Bosnian Australian scholar and who is very active and who actually coined the phrase 11th phase of genocide, which is genocide triumphalism, where I told him that after reading his book about Srebrenica, of course, I cried a lot, but where I told him how I feel guilty, or I asked him whether I have a right to talk about this when I just started being more vocal and write about it, because I was not there in Bosnia and Herzegovina when that was happening. And I almost felt like I needed a permission by somebody like him who lost so much more. And he was so incredible in terms of first, not just kindness. And I don't want to get emotional, but he was just saying, you don't need my permission, in the sense that Bosnia is a story of so many stories that need to be kept told. But that idea of always being aware of so much atrocity and loss, and his kind of permission, which then allowed me to just put gas and feel that I should use any resource that I have to defend my people in the face of so much more power asymmetry that we have addressed somehow in many occasions during this conversation. So that said, again, I don't know whether I will cut it, but it's very personally important. And if it stays, I want to thank Haris for all the mentorship again that he has offered and continues to offer to all younger scholars. So Harun, please, to go back to your opinion about this idea of trauma and your thoughts about future with the European Union or out, with the rising Islamophobia ever so much globally, or our place in terms of whether these conversations among ourselves are taking us.
Yeah, all very good questions. I think that I kind of ended that thread that I had on a slightly more optimistic note, and I think I can replicate the same here, perhaps. I think that there is something very positive to be said about how people from, let's say, our broader community have been able to create these kind of spaces and venues for these sorts of positive projects and for these sorts of conversations. I was involved for a bit in the early stages with the War Childhood Museum in Sarajevo, and just the amount of care that went into that, and being very I was kind of involved in that. There were also people trained in psychology, people working more of NGO space, people with kind of backgrounds in psychiatry and things like that. I mean, everyone kind of brought their expertise, and we were all very careful about what kind of impact will this have on the community? We certainly were very careful not to just re-traumatize people. And it became, it was a key part of the mission of that organization, was to allow people to tell their stories in a way that would, be healing, and also to tell stories of themselves as survivors, ultimately, which is what they, the way that they saw themselves. So I think, I'm encouraged to see places like the War Childhood Museum succeed, also to see the work of Emi Suljagic at the Srebrenica Memorial Center, and elsewhere, big and small. On Twitter, some of the conversations I'm seeing between not just Bosnians, but people from, Syria or Kosovo, that's fantastic. And I think that we need to kind of we need to encourage and maintain those connections, because we're not going to be able to, we're not going to be able to accomplish that kind of critical work that we need to do simply within the confines of kind of institutional Western academia, where we have some of these, structures up against us. So in that sense, it's positive. And in fact, these sorts of statements about chosen trauma and this sudden concern about, Srebrenica as a sort of, part, as like a constructed national project or whatever, I think ultimately reflect that there is this new Bosnian initiative to kind of speak our stories on our own terms. I think that's ultimately what it does reflect. So in that sense, I think, there's reasons to be optimistic going forward.
Yeah, and I do want to mention one part that amongst so much burdensome politics, even though today we did hopefully manage to address that humane and human aspect of this intergenerational legacies, something that I definitely want to keep following as the scientific research continues. And that is literally how many scientists are continually studying how trauma or stressors can be passed down through generations, as in passed down by being remembered in the cells of the body. It is called epigenetic inheritance of trauma. And so far, from all I've read, we've seen in mice that the fear of trauma or stress, whatever you want to call it, might be epigenetically inherited. And these studies continue, but there is so much that needs to be said about the physical and psychological aspects of what I've been recently thinking about as manipulations of pain and almost intentional infliction of harm after the actual atrocities are being committed, and what we have been seeing throughout different actions, words, occasions, and events and policies. So that said, and of course, there's so much more to talk about the internal situation in Bosnia in terms of youth unemployment and so much more, so many people leaving. That is completely conversation on its own. But I think that there is absolutely a generation of activists within Bosnia and Herzegovina and in the region. And Jasmin mentioned Albanians and Kosovars, and they have a class of scholars who are very, very good and very vocal, and who write about local critiques, whether it's state building process or any of the other policies and frameworks that they're not included in. So we did say a little bit about the future. Now that we are getting towards the end, I do want to ask you about something that is not related to politics, because I want precisely my listeners and viewers to see you not just an expert on what you study, but as humans who have all sorts of amazing interests, maybe hobbies, or what you will share with us. So here are 5 sweet questions for the end. Please feel free to respond in any order. The first one is this. Unfortunately, COVID-19 pandemic is not over by any means in many places around the world. So in your particular circumstances, is there anything that you would not want to forget from the lockdowns and the pandemic era?
I guess I would just say that, and this is, in a sense, is connected to what we've been talking about, that one of the great benefits of the lockdowns was getting to spend more time with my family, and not really wanting to give that up. So as we kind of move, perhaps in whatever fashion, to some kind of, I don't want to say post-COVID, but post-lockdown world at the very least. I think I'm definitely in the camp of those people where I'm not really interested in giving up that time that I have with my kids and with my wife and all of that. And I think hopefully more of us will insist on that as just kind of a necessity of life. Like I don't want to work 8 to 6 and then see my kids before bedtime and that's it. Like, no, I actually want to spend the better part of my day with my kids, and then I'll squeeze a little bit of work in there somewhere. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I can resonate with that. Harun, what about you?
I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with everything Yasmin said. It's been great to be able to, spend more time with my wife and also with my parents during the pandemic. But I was going to bring up something a little more mundane, which is that I've enjoyed the America's rediscovery of kind of pedestrian life and alfresco dining. I mean, that's something that was just completely missing in our very automobile dependent society. And now, everywhere I go, whether in Ann Arbor, Michigan, or, Cambridge, Massachusetts, you have streets that are more blocked off to cars, and there's more place for people to walk and socialize and have dinner outside with their friends. I really hope that's something that's going to stick around, and something that's going to be more integrated into American culture from here on out.
I wholeheartedly hope so too. Second question, Yasmin, which of your personality traits has been the most useful? Not the best trait, but the most useful.
I think so something that doesn't come across on Twitter, but is really like categorical to my personhood in many ways, is I kind of get uncomfortable if I go more than about a minute or 2 minutes without making like some kind of dumb joke. So it's like humor and sort of silliness is really important to who I am actually in real life. And I think oftentimes I've gotten the sense when people who kind of only know me from Twitter get a chance to meet me in real life, they're like, wow, you're weird. Like, what is this? Like, are you drunk? Like, no, this is just how I am. So I think in a way, not taking myself too seriously and also refusing to allow other people to get too high on their horse in my presence has been really useful. My dad always used to say, if you ever think anyone is better than you, just imagine the Queen of England on the toilet. And this was like his little way of saying, we're all human beings at the end of the day, and no one is inherently better than you, or for that matter, you're not inherently better than anyone else. So just keep that in mind. And so, yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, now we know. Yasmin makes good jokes. Let's keep them coming online. I think that's also important. I think I don't know. I'm trying to find my own balance between trying to show that I am a human who doesn't just tweet about politics and then just getting it off balance. And then people, I don't know, it's complicated. Twitter is complicated. I didn't get to ask you about how you deal with digital hate. So if you feel free to slide it in and share some advice, please feel free. But Harun, tell us, which of your personality traits has been the most useful?
The personality trait that has been the most useful, while not necessarily being good, is probably my I credit it with making it through graduate school and finishing the PhD.
Wait, but say it in English. How would you translate that?
I think it literally means spite, but it has cultural connotations that are hard.
It has a different good connotations in some context in our.
Yes, and I would like to add that my way with dealing with online hate on Twitter is to go through Yasmin's comments and just preemptively block everyone who was there. It's been pretty useful so far. So.
Yeah. Okay.
You're welcome.
Tried that. Okay. When you have 30 minutes of free time, how do you pass that time?
That's a very good question. I have aquariums.
Oh, in plural?
Yes, I have two. I'm slowly trying to introduce the topic of a third one to my wife, just casually slide it into conversation. So I like that. It's my little,
But how many fish do you have? I have aquarium with 2 fish for my.
Well, so the other one probably has about 15 fish and like more shrimp than I can count. And then another one is just kind of a betta fish tank. So I really like it. It's very slow moving. It's very peaceful. I like kind of making the little landscapes and things. I find it very therapeutic. And I think, since we're talking about trauma and PTSD, I think there's, I think a lot of Bosnians that I've talked to who are very cognizant and open about their mental health, I think one of the themes that I've discovered through talking to many generations of Bosnians about this is the theme of water, and sitting by rivers specifically, and watching them meander. And I think there must be something about water that's restorative or something therapeutic about it. So that's my 30 minutes, is staring at my fish tanks.
And what about you, Harun? Do you have any?
It's a tough question, to be honest. I feel like I've just been working a lot lately. It's a very but yeah, so I don't know. I spend about 30 minutes a day driving my wife back and from the to and from the subway stations to help out. So driving on the highway and listening to whatever on Spotify is kind of my little moment of zen. Yeah, that's the honest answer.
That's wonderful. And I know that Yasmin is an incredibly helpful dad, because sometimes we message each other about parental responsibilities and sicknesses. So I appreciate that, and celebrate partners who participate in family life and support professional and personal development. So kudos to you, Harun, for that. What skill or craft would you like to master, guys?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Well, I play the accordion, so I would like to have more time to devote to that. And I've sort of played it on and off since about the age of like 6 or 7. So right now I'm definitely in a more off period, but
you cannot now just unsay that. The masses would demand
right
a video, a clip of
a little bit of a Makedonsko devojče. No, so it's I would like to spend a little bit more time. I'm not some like great musician for this thing from, but it's it's something that's good for the mind, I think, good for the soul, as it were, just spending a little bit of time. So in the ideal universe where I wasn't changing diapers and dealing with princess dresses for about 48 hours of every 24-hour day, I would probably spend it on music and the accordion.
Harun, what skill or craft would you like to master?
Honestly, I feel like I've had an acoustic guitar sitting in the corner of like various bedrooms for the past like 20 years or so. So one day I'll get to it, and that'll be a special day indeed.
That's music is really important, and any sort of actually also art. I mean, the research shows that it is so therapeutic as well. So that said, last question: are any of your friends, guys, completely opposite to you, or are most of them similar to you?
I would say the vast majority of my kind of real life friends are in a completely different like universe. There's very few people in my immediate friend circle who work in politics or policy or even academia. My closest friend circle of kind of the guys that I grew up with in Vancouver, Canada, they're all like they work in hospitals and they're physiotherapists, and one of them is a librarian, and they're all super intelligent, learned guys. But I think in many ways people would be surprised. I maintain a very severe separation between my kind of public and private life, and I think that's important for me. It's really important for my family. It's a way that I protect my family. But yeah, so I try to really keep those two worlds as separate as I can. I mean, there's obviously people who I'm friends with, but who are also colleagues. So obviously there's some of that. But for the most part, I try to keep my public and private very, very separate.
And Harun, what about you?
I think in practice, so many of the close friends that I have now are people that I've kind of met through the journey of going through academia, doing research and things like that. So people both in the US and in Bosnia and elsewhere. And that's been nice, honestly, looking back on it. That's one of my favorite things about the whole experience. So, in some ways, I guess they are similar to me, but I did have a fun experience. Well, I was in Ann Arbor, back in Ann Arbor in Michigan for much of the pandemic recently, because that's where I grew up after the war, once we had left Sarajevo. And, while there, I was eventually able to reconnect with some friends who I hadn't seen since high school. And it was really nice. And it was just such a trip to realize that, not everyone had gone into the weeds of Balkan history or whatever. It was refreshing. It was great to catch up with people. So I hope that I can do more of that going forward as well.
Yeah. Well, that said, and in terms of just friendships or collegiality, I want to thank both of you for taking out the time from your busy schedules to share some of your thoughts. I know we could have gone so much longer, and I already have things that, we should have talked about this as well. But I think that this is a great we talk about this on Twitter a lot, but I did want one more time to compile this in one place so that all those who want to learn and hear a little bit, whether they're Bosnians or not, actually, I think a lot of people could find themselves within these conversations about representation and trauma and dehumanization. Thank you so much. Is there anything that you would like to add to the listeners and viewers before we wrap it up and say goodbye?
No, I mean, thank you for hosting us and for this platform. I think it's really terrifically important that these conversations happen. And I guess, just to kind of harp on that last point that you made, I think all of the comments that we said, even some of the stuff that was more critical and coming from a more pain place, et cetera, really all of this is about inviting more conversation and more exchange. Yes, along the parameters of realizing and recognizing trauma and pain and historical facts, speaking to the right people and elevating the right people, elevating the narratives and the experiences of survivors. But it is about more conversation, but the right kind of conversation. And I thank you for making this space to have what I would consider the right kind of conversation.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you, Riada.
And to all our listeners and viewers, please feel free to share the comments and share these conversations with others who might be interested. Stay tuned for more conversations with people from all around the globe, and hold tight to those you love. Stay well and have a good day.